30,000 people vanished. The government said it never happened. No graves, no trials, no announcements, no bodies washed ashore with names attached, just absence. A daughter who left for university and never came home. A husband who went to work one morning and simply ceased to exist. A neighbor whose door stayed locked and whose name, over time, people stopped saying out loud. This is not a war story in the traditional sense. There were no front lines, no enemy uniforms, no declared conflict between nations. This is the story of a government that turned on its own people, that built a secret machinery of disappearance so efficient, so deliberate, so carefully designed to leave no trace, that for years, the only proof it existed was the silence it left behind. And while it was happening, the world came to watch a football tournament. Part 1. The Country Before the Darkness. To understand what Argentina lost, you need to understand what Argentina was. By the mid-20th century, Buenos Aires was one of the most culturally vibrant cities in the world, a city of universities and bookshops, of tango and theater, of a middle class that read philosophy and argued politics over coffee. Argentina had one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America. Its universities were world-class. Its civil society was alive and loud. That aliveness was precisely the problem. For certain people, Argentina in the 1970s was politically turbulent. The country had cycled through governments, coups, and periods of instability for decades. There were genuine leftist guerrilla movements operating, the Montoneros, the ERP, who carried out bombings and assassinations. The violence was real. The instability was real. But what happened on March 24, 1976, was not a response proportional to that instability. It was something else entirely. On that date, a military junta led by General Jorge Rafael Videla seized power in a coup. And from that moment, Argentina entered a period that would come to be known by the name the regime itself used, the Dirty War. La Guerra Sucia. Part 2. The Machinery of Disappearance. The junta had a theory. They called it the doctrine of national security. The idea was that Argentina faced an internal enemy, not just armed guerrillas, but anyone whose ideas might be considered subversive. Students who organized, journalists who asked questions, lawyers who defended the wrong clients, psychologists, because the junta considered psychology itself a subversive discipline, union leaders, teachers, priests who sided with the poor, and anyone who knew them, friends, family members, colleagues, who might carry their dangerous ideas forward. The response was not arrest and trial. Trials required evidence. Trials were public. Trials created records. Instead, they built a system of disappearance. People were taken, usually at night, usually by plain-clothed security forces arriving in unmarked Ford Falcons, the car that became the symbol of terror across Argentina. Taken from their homes, from the street, from their workplaces, taken in front of their children, taken while their neighbors watched from behind curtains and said nothing, because saying something meant you might be next. They were brought to one of an estimated 500 clandestine detention centers operating across the country, places with names that still carry weight in Argentine memory. The ESMA, the Navy Mechanics School in Buenos Aires, which alone processed an estimated 5,000 prisoners, a place with a basement and an attic, and a staff of torturers who worked regular shifts. Inside these centers, prisoners were tortured, electric shocks, waterboarding, beatings designed not to kill but to break, to extract names, to map networks, to produce more names, which led to more disappearances, which produced more names still, and then, in most cases, they were killed. Part 3. The flights. The regime had a problem with bodies. Bodies are evidence. Bodies can be found. Bodies can be identified. Bodies create records and give families something to bury and something to point to. So they developed a solution. On what became known as death flights, prisoners were drugged, given sedatives strong enough to render them unconscious, but not enough to kill them, loaded onto military aircraft, and dropped alive into the Rio de la Plata, the vast estuary between Argentina and Uruguay, into the open ocean, into water deep enough and wide enough to swallow a person completely. This was not a secret within the military. It was an organized operation. Pilots flew the routes. Officers signed the orders. Chaplains, in some documented cases, blessed the men before they boarded. The Catholic Church's institutional role during this period remains one of the most painful chapters in Argentine history. While individual priests and nuns were among the disappeared, some tortured and killed precisely because of their advocacy for the poor, the church hierarchy largely remained silent, and in some documented cases, actively cooperated with the regime. Estimates suggest that between 1976 and 1983, approximately 30,000 people were disappeared. The exact figure remains contested. The regime destroyed records, but 30,000 is the number carried by the human rights organizations, by the survivors, by the mothers. Fewer than 1,000 bodies have ever been formally identified. The rest are still in the water. Part 4. The World Cup. In 1978, 2 years into the killing, Argentina hosted the FIFA World Cup. The junta understood the propaganda value of this perfectly. They poured resources into the tournament. They built stadiums. They organized crowds. They managed international press with careful precision. Journalists who asked the wrong questions found their access restricted, their credentials questioned. Argentina won the tournament. The streets of Buenos Aires filled with celebration. General Videla appeared in photographs alongside FIFA officials, smiling, shaking hands, presenting the image of a nation at peace with itself and with the world. One of those World Cup stadiums, the River Plate Stadium, sat in Buenos Aires, and within a short distance of that stadium was the ESMA detention center. Prisoners held there have testified that during the World Cup, they could hear the roar of the crowds through the walls. They could hear 70,000 people cheering while they sat in the dark. Several foreign governments knew enough about what was happening to raise concerns. Some did. Many did not. The United States government, under the Ford and early Carter administrations, was broadly aware of the junta's methods and continued diplomatic and military relationships regardless. Documents declassified in later decades confirmed that American officials had detailed knowledge of the disappearances. The world watched football. The disappeared stayed disappeared. Part 5. The Mothers. While the regime built its machinery of silence, a group of women began to make noise. They were mothers, housewives, mostly. Women who had no political background, no organizational experience, no protection. Women who had lost children and who could not accept the official answer, which was no answer, which was silence, which was, in the regime's preferred phrase, that their children had simply gone abroad, or gone underground, or had never really existed as the mothers remembered them. In April 1977, a small group of these women began gathering in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, the central square in front of the government palace. They walked in circles wearing white headscarves, carrying photographs of their missing children. They came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The regime called them Las Locas, the crazy women. It was meant as dismissal. It became a title they wore with absolute dignity. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo still march every Thursday. They have marched for nearly 50 years. The white headscarf, originally made from a baby's diaper, has become one of the most recognized symbols of human rights resistance in the world. Some of the mothers were themselves disappeared. Azucena Villaflor, one of the founders, was abducted in 1977 and killed. Her remains were identified decades later, recovered from a mass grave. She was reburied in the Plaza de Mayo, in the square where she had walked. Part 6. Justice and its limits. The junta collapsed in 1983, discredited by economic failure and the catastrophic military defeat in the Falklands War. Democracy returned, and with it came the question of accountability. In 1985, Argentina conducted the trial of the juntas, a civilian prosecution of the former military leadership that was historic in Latin America. Videla and several others were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Then came the full stop law and the due obedience law, amnesties passed in the late 1980s that protected lower-ranking officers who claimed they were following orders. The prosecutions stalled. Men who had run the detention centers, who had administered the torture, walked free. Those laws were eventually annulled in 2003. Prosecutions resumed. Videla died in prison in 2013. Hundreds of former officers have since been convicted in trials that continue to this day. But justice, when it arrives 40 years late, is a complicated thing. Most of the perpetrators lived full lives before facing consequences. Most of the disappeared were never found. Most families never had a funeral. 30,000 people vanished. The government said it never happened. What remains is this: a Thursday march that has continued for nearly 50 years. A white headscarf that became a symbol seen around the world. A generation of children stolen at birth from disappeared mothers, given to military families, raised under false names, some of whom are still discovering today who they actually are. And a stadium, still standing, where 70,000 people once cheered, while a few kilometers away, in a building with a basement and a roster of guards who worked regular shifts, people sat in the dark and listened. The crowd noise carried through the walls. Nobody came.